Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review from the world of Project Gotham. Project Gotham 3 in particular once again, and this time we're looking at a car which is not uncommon for the Project Gotham series, and that is a much more niched, you could say boutique exotic, in the same vein as stuff like Pajamas, Maserati, Spiker, even companies like Celine to some degree, or Callaway, and that company is of course Wiesmann. It's a German brand, kind of like the German equivalent of Morgan to some degree, but more exotic, more out there, more oddball you could say as well. BMW powered for the most part. And as far as this one goes, this is one of the older, more original Wiesmanns, if you will. It doesn't have the V10 engine from the M5 or the twin-turbo engine from the later M5, the F10 shape. This is just the Wiesmann GT. And it's funny because at this kind of time period, it wasn't just Project Gotham that featured this car and showed it love. You had it in Test Drive Unlimited, you had it in Forza as well, but in Forza, of course, it was those aforementioned higher level models like the MF5s. This one, though, it's more the OG. It has that purer, simpler, cleaner shape, a lot less power, and it is slower, but to say it's slow is a relative term. It's slow in as much as a TVR lower level model is slow. Still very fast, just not quite as quick as the later models are. Now, as far as the spec, as I said, you're looking at BMW power, 4.4 litre engine. Of course, it is front engine, rear-wheel drive, no surprises there. 333 horsepower, as quoted in the game, but it weighs less than 1,200 kilos. And for a car that has the level of style and attention to detail that this one does, that's a very good weight to be working with, because typically 1,200 kilos in a sports car, especially a slightly larger exotic one, not that this is a big car, but you know what I mean, it's no MX-5, that's for sure. That is an unusually lightweight vehicle, because typically 1,200 kilos or less tends to be reserved for the cars which really are super lightweight, like TVRs, Nobles, that kind of thing, whereas a car more like this, and even something like a Spiker, typically you'd be looking at over 1,200, sometimes even 1,300 or more. So the fact that this one is still lightweight is a great sign. And simply put, the reason why I say that is because with a car that is lighter, especially when it comes to a sports car, it doesn't need to have a huge amount of power. Now, this one, for instance, as I said, with the 333 horsepower output, that's a similar amount of power to what something like an R34 Skyline might have in its stock form, or something like a Mustang, for instance. That's not a huge amount of power for a sports car to have. That's actually more lower level, sometimes mid, in occasional cases, sports car territory, not really exotic territory, especially from a car that does have a 130,000 credit price tag. But what it can do with the power, as I will often say about cars on the channel, that is where it becomes impressive. In a similar way to cars like the Noble and the TVR, because they have around 300 to 350 horsepower more often than not, very rarely above that. It only tends to be stuff like the Sagaris, for instance, or the later Noble M600, but the cars that came out at a similar time to this one, like the Tuscan, the Noble M12, they have a very similar amount of power, but they're not this kind of machine in a straight out sense, because as I already said, the Noble is a much more hardcore, track-focused machine, and the TVR is, you could argue, somewhere in between, but definitely more of a road car in its leaning. It's more about the fun, the look, the sound, and not so much about the lap times. Of course, that's more the Sagaris kind of territory. This one, I would say, is much closer to Spiker in that way, because they're not the most powerful thing around, they're very expensive, but they're very exclusive. You don't tend to see them that much even at car shows, and they're the kind of car where it just immediately attracts a lot of attention wherever you are. It might not win that many races, and even if it does, people might not really know the brand for doing so, because that's not really what they're all about at the end of the day. It's about just making this completely unique, somewhat oddball approach to a sports car, which doesn't have the widest appeal possible, that's for sure. It will never outsell something like a Corvette or a Porsche 911 or even a TVR necessarily, but it's not trying to. It's the kind of car for someone like me. I love cars that are unabashedly different, that aren't trying to be the best thing around, they're just totally unique on the market. And this, as I said, being kind of like the German Morgan in some ways, kind of like Morgan meets Spiker actually, that to me definitely ticks the boxes. Now, funnily enough, even though I do love cars like this, I've never been a massive fan of Wiesmann, which is funny because usually I would, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, because it really does tick, as I said, all of the boxes of a car which I would usually love, but for whatever reason I'm just not a huge fan of them, and there are some occasions where that happens with other cars and other categories of car as well. But as far as how it falls into Project Gotham, as I said, it's not necessarily trying to be the most successful track car or even competition vehicle around, and certainly not trying to be the fastest thing around in a straight line. And that could be a problem, because of course it's a racing game, so it needs to be at least good enough to win. So the question is it? Well, to put things simply, I would say don't bother buying something like a Wiesmann or a Spiker necessarily unless you've already got the cars that can win, maybe even win easily, or at least are competitive enough to win, and then buy stuff like this if it floats your boat. Because if you can buy a Wiesmann and then win a race with it, that's a nice bonus, but it's not the reason why you should buy it, because, as I mentioned, it's not really about that. It happens to be a car that is capable of winning under certain circumstances, but if you're looking purely to win, especially when it comes to like bang for buck and that kind of stuff, just stick with like a European rival from Porsche, maybe something like a Corvette from America, or even a Japanese GTR or something like that, because at the end of the day, it is just what I said earlier. Unashamedly a total, boutique, unique, oddball sports car. And that is exactly what it offers. Nothing more, nothing less. So if that appeals to you, definitely go for it. Is it tail happy? To some degree. Not quite as tail happy as you might expect it to be, but it can certainly drift if you want it to. The looks will certainly divide opinion. It's a little bit more bloated looking than a Morgan, for instance. Looks kind of like a Morgan that's got stung in the face by a bee. But if that's, your style, then you'll probably love it in a similar way to how I feel about Spiker. They certainly aren't for everyone, but they're definitely for me. But that's it for my thoughts on the Wiesmann. Definitely worth a look, because especially these days you do not see it popping up in many games, and I think that's a shame. I guess for licensing reasons, whatever the case may be, but in this particular sweet spot of the 2000s, you could find Wiesmann, as I said, in a number of games. Test Drive Unlimited, Project Gotham, Forza, probably a couple of others too that I'm not thinking of. So if it's the kind of thing that does float your boat, go back, go on your Xbox 360 or PS2, depending on the game, pull it out and have a drive, because it certainly has a lot to offer when it comes to the fun factor. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.